The making of sculpture doesn't have any literal path. It's all trial and error, an inch at a time in a cloud of dust. And you just build the sculpture over time based on impulse on a daily basis. It's important to keep the thread going to work every day and to work things through to completion, which is a gift in itself. To actually finish something to the degree to which you think it needs to be finished. In other words, you're not rushed by commercial interest or emotional attachment. The sculpture is your friend, and you're working with your friend on a project, and you want to finish it. In a way, I've always thought of myself as a non-participant observer. And in that way, I don't care what people think of my sculpture. I have no interest. My ancestors from Northern Europe were barbarians, basically, and one of the rituals that they went through a couple thousand years ago or more, they would do a lot of human sacrifice. And some of the bodies were preserved in peat bogs. They would have the group of people that would paint themselves blue and do their rituals out in the woods and the fields, would sacrifice various people, usually through guillotine or stabbing. I mean, they did men and women. They were very broad-minded that way. And they would just hurl the bodies into the fields, and they would eventually get buried by peat. So 2,000 years later, you get a bog harvester, or whatever they're called, that run these machines through the bog, would come across these desiccated figures preserved by the various chemicals in the bog itself. So they became, at a certain point, of interest to me. You get a particular blend between the clothing that was preserved and the skin that was preserved. They all be kind of fused together. So it gave me the idea of embedding cloth and clay and other things and making figures. And this is one of the figures I did at that time, called Dom. It's in bronze, and it's 6 feet long, maybe 60 inches maybe. It's displayed as it is on the floor, usually on sand, and has a couple of artifacts around it. It's only been shown a couple of times, and nobody has ever commented on it to me. This piece is another bronze. It's called Eve as Death. And the particular item that behind this piece, I believe, as I try to remember, was novels by Hermann Hesse. There are several novels, Narcissus and Goldmond particularly, that had a tremendous impact upon me, as well as others at art, but particularly Narcissus and Goldmond. And I can't separate in my own, or couldn't separate in my own mind, the ideas generated in that book or those books, and my dreams or my realities. His literature created in my head certain psychological views or angles on looking at the contemporary world and the older world. One of them's Dom there on the second from the left. The other one's the one on the far left is a recent unpleasantness. So the piece was fashioned in clay, modeled in clay, and cast in plaster when it was finished. And this is the original plaster cast. This plaster piece is part of a set of plaster pieces, all from the same matrix, all from the same original sculpture. It started out with one, and then I made molds and sections so that I can make different postures and arrangements of figures. This particular figure is called Mirror Man. He's about 6 feet tall. He stands alone in his quest to get some answers about himself, which one is not entirely encouraged that he's going to get there, but he's trying. He interacts with others, although this piece also acts as a single freestanding piece of sculpture. The whole group is a set of 12 figures forming a piece called Vivo Stücke. The name comes from Primo Levi's memoirs. We can see another example from this group over here on the floor called Help Me. Help Me. Over here is Headstander, and he is the same figure in a different posture. There is a fragment of one here. He doesn't have his arms on. He's called, well, I can't remember what he's called. And this guy here was the original Matrix, actually. He's called Floating Shade. This guy is called the Beggar. Incidentally, many of the titles I give to things are only for identification and either confusion or obviousness. This piece has 2 names. It's Evidence/Exit Interview. It's a gal, although that could be disputed, like a lot of these figures. It's ambiguous, I guess one might say, but to me it's a gal. And the thought came from a photograph originally, a photograph we took in the 20s of an expired woman in a chair in an interior. It's hard to tell whether from the photograph whether she was dead or sleeping, but the subtitles told you that she was expired. The exit interview part of it was a recreation of an actual event of me having a final interview, what they call in colleges an exit interview, when somebody is hired and their hire is over. The powers that be interview them, presumably to prop up the person, to make them feel better that they're exiting. And I had the occasion of doing this at one time with a person that I had some association with. And so this is a recreation. The information is very important to me to recreate certain circumstances or ideas, thoughts, fantasies, dreams in my own life. And this was one of them that I devoted some time to make this figure exit interview or evidence. So they can take their choice, which is which. So that's a good example of whether titles or a little bit of information actually helps or doesn't help. And no conclusion can be drawn from it. No positive, no negative. And it's the same with titling sculpture or music or lots of things. And they're titled for identification. And these figures called recognition, remembrance. This is a projection of an artist's idea about where this culture that we live in is going. Each of these figures have their own interior set of problems. They have a leader. They have somebody, a guy who's out front who seems to have some sense of hesitancy. None of them inspire a lot of hope. You don't know whether they're advancing or backing up. They're in a quandary. And that's what I see in humanity in general in the world, that the future is uncertain. We don't know where we're going or why we're going anywhere. The possibilities aren't great. There's no indication in my lifetime of any historical figure that steps forward to guide humanity in a certain way. So a lot is abandonment of various gods and goddesses over time, and we're left with nothing. And it's not, these people, these sculptures they all have their own sense of dignity, but they're going nowhere fast. Different things have motivated me. I haven't talked a whole lot about the early heads that I did that are much more hermetic and sealed. I worked on heads at the beginning for many years, maybe 10, and then morphed into doing full figures, and then the figures got larger, and then the figures got a little bit more movement than they had before, and they interacted a little bit with each other more than they had before. And so there was an evolution, but I look at them as interchangeable, that the most recent sculpture can live with the farthest away sculpture. They both came from the same source. They have different impulses maybe, but it's mostly an attempt to get to some sense of reality. Reality being something larger than your individual self, and thinking about what you feel and think, which is boring to me. Because people are different, and we all know they're different, but there's something else that wants to be gotten to other than those differences. Hair color, that stuff toenails, that doesn't interest me. What does interest me is Delacroix's statement, a simple statement that had a great effect on me. He said in the 1840s, "I like the look of fresh blood." Now, one might wonder, what did he mean by that? Which is also a nice idea to think about, what did he mean by that? But I take it that he preferred reality than something else getting in the way. He's trying to get to something real. So I would say that what really lies behind if I look back, I didn't think that. I don't start out thinking I'm going to try to make something real. But the idea of thinking back, looking over the whole production of 40 or 50 years of sculpture, I think that's trying to get to some tangible reality that speaks to my inner self or reflects my inner self, which may change over time slightly, but not much. There's a fleeing from psychological determinants in human behavior, which is what I was always interested in myself. I myself was raised like a lot of people, problematic family, tried to get out of the house as much as I could. I had a lot of friends when I was young. Tried to flee from what damage was being inflicted on me. I had two older siblings that I always visioned it like I was the third wave at Omaha Beach, and my sister was in the first wave, and my brother was in the second wave. And by the time I came ashore, There were just dead bodies all over the place. The fighting was over. So I somehow escaped my family. There was this place where I drive along, I don't remember the route number, up and around 295, something like that, up and around Trenton. And off to the left in the fall, one time I was driving along, up on the top of a hill was a tree in the configuration that, roughly speaking, that this tree, it was early winter, late fall, so all the leaves had fallen off this partial tree. But I took pictures of it as I was driving along at 70 miles an hour. With cameras were different then, they weren't quite as good, so I'd get these blurry pictures of this tree and I recreated it on top of this mound. About the time that I was making it, my father was dying. He was a chemist. He was very well known worldwide, and he had worked his lifetime with munitions, dynamites, explosives, propellants for missiles during World War II and then during the Cold War. What was killing him was some form of dementia, probably generated by him working in a shack lab out and back of the Hercules Powder Company in Wilmington, Delaware. It's my belief that at that time he got mercury poisoning and suffered 50% shrinkage of his brain upon his autopsy. So at that time, in my mind were ideas of tombs and death and other such matters. It's kind of a shrine or a tomb that the viewer is free to approach and look at it. It has no signage or anything that prepares the viewer for this. So many questions come to mind and people can feel free, to wonder about it, what it means. And it was about that time that I was working on this synagogue as AIDS Memorial, and the synagogue figure, an astute observer would realize that it's a refashioning of an older piece, same size, called Synagogue. And that piece is over there. For Synagogue's AIDS Memorial, I've added, she has a banner, she has a broken lance, she has a book of tablets or something in her hand, and she has at the foot of her base a still life of hypodermic needles, bones, and a severed hand, a skull, and some medical vials. I would say, in terms of my own mind of a spectator looking at this, might be partially or completely bewildered as to what it means. The figure behind this, the original synagogue that I did, was part of my wanderings, which I did for many years through Europe to museums, churches, and exhibitions and galleries and various shrines. And the synagogue figure exists in real life in Strasbourg, France, and on their cathedral there on I think it's at the south portal, on one side of the door on the left, there's the church, a very kind of upright, regal figure holding a cross, woman looking steadfast and determined. On the right-hand side is synagogue, the church outcast, head down, twisted, broken lance in her hand with a flag, and to represent the degraded aspects or the anti-church. Probably the Jews would be the most obvious thing to say. Now, and she has in her hand tablets, books of the law that she's either dropping or not holding on in a secure way. That figure really fit in with a lot of other ideas. The figure of synagogue at Strasbourg fit in with a lot of my other ideas about motion in sculpture, movement and motion in electrification, or bringing an inert matter to life. For I had learned, working 3 years with Peter Agostini as his assistant in New York when I was very young, I had learned or watched a man who could enliven inert matter, plaster, clay, stone, bronze, doesn't make any difference. He touches it and it came alive. Very few people have that gift to do that. I'm not saying that I do, but that's what most sculptors, or some types of sculptors, want to do, is enliven inert material. And so synagogue was, among many other sculptures, greatly influential to me in that regard. The synagogue at Strasbourg Cathedral. So if somebody knows, or if I told somebody, which I wouldn't do, except I'm doing it here, but if I told somebody in person or gave a lecture and tried to explain to them the etymology and where this thing comes from, that might help them see the sculpture. But the whole idea of psychological responsibility, that's all been thrown out the window under different emotionally driven psychology or politics, psychological politics. It's been erased. So a lot of people don't understand psychology in terms of art. I don't know why. People are afraid, in a lot of ways, they're afraid to engage art, or they're intimidated by it, or they're angered by it, or they're irritated by it, or they think it's a kind of a way of showing off, or it's too ego-driven in an impossibly ego-driven society. It's seeing where it's not ego-driven at all. It's self-ego, maybe. Most of the work is done on your own, by yourself, in isolation, listening to music, or drinking coffee in your studio, drinking beer, smoking cigarettes if you smoke, And you can see, it's not a personal thing. You can, and I do, because I have all these books that I collected in years and years and years of books and catalogs and shows of fantastic artists, all who have come onto the earth, worked, and have disappeared, and nobody knows who they are. A few people knew who they were then they were alive, but they're just gone. And I'm not complaining about it. It's okay with me to be ignored and not have a public stance. It's fine. It's completely fine. It's not about art as much as it is about history. History, nobody knows, and they could benefit from knowing a little bit more about history. seems to me an artist like myself is a lot like Don Quixote, that Don Quixote read too many books, and he read too many books about a time that was before him, that he imagined that he could be in or be a participant in. In that world that he lived in, the previous world didn't exist around him, but he didn't really know it. And so he proceeds in his adventures with that in mind. And I look at myself as a kind of a similar artist. The stories that I'm interested in, the books that I read, the psychology that I believed in is all shattered by modern life, particularly the psychological part. You know, you want to be fair to all sculptures and treat everybody the same, that they needed to be represented, these parts of figures. Can't cast every particular piece in bronze, full piece, so you know, a lot of heads were around the studio, so I decided to kind of put them together in a conglomeration on a rack, and so they would have some life for themselves in bronze. And it's sort of like a rogues gallery is the way I look at it. And some of the pieces are individual heads. There's a head on the first shelf, the second one in, which was inspired by an idea that of my father. You know, it's not a portrait, it's just kind of a father or my father-like head that I made at some point. There's on the top, third from the right is a head of Chopin, but many of the other ones are off of Eva's death or the world's greatest sculptor and so forth. They're patinaed in kind of earth colors or greens, light greens, to make them look older, and as time goes by, they do look older, so they become like artifacts. Amidst them are a few smaller pieces that have been added over the years for just to get a sense of scale. And there's one piece on the floor that seemingly has fallen off, so the viewer can try to figure out where it's fallen off, but there's no place that it's fallen off for, but it's still there on the floor. And you go into any good museum, or even not so good museum, and you can find things that link you together with the larger force of humanity. So this current level of unhappiness in the world that I watch and hear and listen to every day is misguided, I think, somehow. It's politically misguided and misses point of what's happened in the world in the first 25,000 years of history.